Hello everybody and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll dive into an aspect that is actually a very first on this channel right now, but I guess it will be a foundation for many other videos to come around this topic, and this is software architecture. And we will start very slow because I have received a lot of feedback on different videos that the content is actually great, but how do we actually start an application from scratch, how we define our application layers, what we put in each layer. So I have decided to start this series on software architecture with a video on a very standard layered ASP.NET Core applications and how we start it and structure it and architect it from the scratch. So we'll cover the different layers that we will have and what exactly we should put in all the layers. So let's get started with it right away. This time we'll start from the Visual Studio starting window, from which we can actually create a brand new project. Now, of course, when you create a new project, you usually go for create new project. You choose to create an API or an ASP.NET Core Web application or a Blazor application, whatever. And then that's it. You kind of then add some projects afterwards if you need. But mainly when you start already with a project. However, when you start a new application from scratch, I would strongly advise, and this is a practice that I am always implementing and always doing when starting a brand new application, is to actually start from a brand new solution without any project, and we'll see exactly why. So then the first step, or the very first step that we want, is to create actually a blank solution. Now here in my case, you would see here on the left side that I can already choose a blank solution, but this is because I have used it a lot. So you might not see it when you open your Visual Studio, but here in this search box, you can just simply try to type blank solution and you will find this option right away. So let's click on next and then go to the other screen. And here is the first very important thing, which is the naming of the solution. And you might say, hey, but naming, that's not quite really important. What I would say is that especially if you're building some class libraries, naming is definitely important, and what I actually like to do is, whenever I start a brand new project, I would like to create this type of blank solution and name it as the application that I'm currently building. So if I'm building, I don't know, an application that is called My App, then I would name the solution My App. In our case, what we want to do during this video is simply start from the template that we have in the ASP.NET Core Web API, and then kind of refactor it a little bit and put every pieces that we have in the template right in one single project in the different layers where the different parts might belong. So the template is about weather forecast. In this case, we will name our application weather forecasts, and therefore also the solution will be named weather forecast. So let's start typing weather forecasts. Once again, the name of the solution you usually want to choose or to correspond to the name of the application or the system that you want to build or that you are starting right now to build. So let's click on next, and this should then just open Visual Studio with this blank solution. Now, why I like to say that I really like to start with a blank solution is that if you start with a project, you would probably also name that project something that reflects what that project does. So you would probably have started by having an ASP.NET Core Web API, and you would have named the project API. Now the problem is the solution would have had the exact same naming as the first project in it. And this is a thing that I totally like to avoid, because I want to have a solution that reflects the name of the application that I'm building. But then for each layer of the application, I want to have a different project, and that in the naming of that project, it should be visible for what or to what application it actually belongs. So it will be weather forecasts, then a dot, and then the name of the layer that that project represents. So let's start doing that. Now let's right click on this solution and then here add new project. Here on this add new project screen, we already also have to do a first decision. When you build a layered application, you would have always the API or the web application or the presentation part of the application, the part that is actually the part with which users interact. And then you would have different projects, as said, that would be, let's say, one-to-one to the layers of the applications that we have. Now, of course, those projects for the different layers are not runnable. They are not applications that we will run. So in that case, for most of the layers, we will use projects, or we will use class library as the project, because what we really like to build for those layers are just libraries, nothing else. So in this case, once again, on the left here, you see that I have here this option class library. This is because I have already used it a lot. But if you don't have it, if you just search here for class library, you will see here this option for class library. Just make sure to select the C# one and not the VB one. So let's click next. And as said, when we name our project, they should contain the name of the application, which is also or corresponds also to the name of the solution, which in our case would be weather forecasts. And then this is the first layer. We will call this the domain layer. And we will choose .NET 5. Right now, this is the most up-to-date version of .NET. By the time we record this, .NET 6 is not already shipped. So it will come in, I guess, 4 weeks. But if you follow this video after .NET 6, you have to know that the things that we cover here actually did not change in .NET 6, so they should be exactly the same. Now we can delete this class because we don't need this class anymore. So let's just delete it, and that should be it. Now the question is, and I always get the question, what should we actually put here in this domain layer? Now here the discussion is a little bit longer, I would say, but it all starts from what we are actually trying to do as software developers. Now, when you start to develop an application, what you really do is actually try to solve a problem in the real world by modeling that aspect of the real world in your application and trying to perform some actions. So for instance, if you are building an online banking application, you would then probably have to model this whole idea of banking, like accounts, like credit cards, like loan, like debt, like interest rate, and things like that. So everything from that specific, let's call it problem domain, should be modeled in our application. Now, all the classes that kind of define this problem domain of our application will be placed here in this domain folder, so in this layer. The idea is that, for instance, if we go back to the banking example, once again, this means that here we would have, for instance, classes like bank, like customer, like bank account, like credit card, like debt, like loan, like interest rate. So all these classes will be placed here because they belong to the core domain of the part of the world that we are actually trying to model in the application that we are building. But more than just regular classes, here we also have to think about behavior that kind of belongs to this type of domain. For instance, if I want to withdraw a sum from my bank account that is actually greater than the money that I actually have there, this should of course not be possible. So this is something that we would roughly call a validation rule. So this time that each time I want to withdraw something, which probably would be a method still here in the same domain layer, like withdraw, to which I would provide my bank account, the sum that I want to withdraw, there would be kind of like a validation or a business rule, let's call it business rule, that would validate if I am able to perform that action or not. And of course, the application would then kind of respond to the result of this validation in a certain way. But to the domain layer, we should also include this type of validation and all type of business rules that we might have. For instance, if I want to open a new bank account, that would be probably a method on, I don't know, bank account open, whatever. But then, for instance, I would have to calculate maybe if I have a fixed interest rate, if I have a dynamic interest rate, and there are certainly requirements that come from the business side, and we have to model them. And all these type of requirements that once again belong to the core problem domain that we are trying to solve with our application, they all belong here in this layer. Let's now get then one step further. So once we have established that the first and most important part of our application is actually the domain layer, because here is actually where everything from our business logic and rules and validations apply and reside, the next thing that each application would have to do is it would have to talk to a database. Now let's go back to the Visual Studio and create a new project for that. As for the database, we have then a totally new layer. So let's add a new project again. Once again, it will be a class library. And here in this class library, once again, the same naming convention, weather forecasts, which is the name of the application and of course, name of the solution, and then data access layer or DAL. Of course, we also choose .NET 5 in this case, and we will create this project. And it is created. We can also remove this class here. We don't need it anymore. And once again, the question, what should we actually place in this class? Once again, or here, at least I guess it's much more straightforward, because in the data access layer, well, of course, we put all our code and classes that kind of have to do with data retrieval, data processing, and persistence. So here we would have, for instance, if we work with Entity Framework Core or Entity Framework, we would have our DB context. Here is where we would have the implementation of our repositories. Here is the place where we would have our Entity Framework configuration classes if we need to do that, and so on. Now, in this example that we will do today, we won't dive into Entity Framework Core because it would add to this video a lot of time. But if you are interested in how to get started with Entity Framework Core and ASP.NET Core, the repository pattern, and using configuration classes, there are different videos here on the Code Wrinkles channel that cover exactly that topics. And you will find the link to those videos in the description of this one, or you might surely see some cards here on the screen, and you can simply just click on them and go to watch those videos too if you are interested in that specific part. But once again, in this layer, we will place all our code that has to do something with the database, and meaning data retrieval, data processing, and data persistence. So writing and updating actually the database with new state. And then there is one other layer that we would have, which is usually called the service layer. So let's add a new project here. Once again, we will choose class library. Here we have this, and once again, weather forecasts, and then dot, and the name of this layer is the service layer. So this would be the service layer. Now, of course, once again, .NET 5. If you are using a 100% clean architecture, then you might call this actually use cases or the use cases layer. However, once again, in the standard layer ASP.NET Core applications, in 80% of the applications that I have ever seen, which are not only the applications that I have started, but applications that a lot of other people that are way smarter than me have started, is actually this type of structure, where we have a domain layer, we have a data access layer, and we have a service layer. Optionally, if we also need other external services or infrastructure services like writing to files, reading files, talking to other APIs, or sending emails and things like that, we would have also another layer which is called infrastructure, and we will also probably add this infrastructure layer later. But for now, this is the whole topic or concept. Now, of course, you may ask yourself exactly the same question. What do we actually place here in this services layer? Well, the answer here is actually also pretty straightforward. Now, the idea is that our data access layer, as said, is only responsible to retrieve data or to write data to the database. In the end, it is not responsible to do anything else. Now, in most of the applications, what we actually need to do is that when we try to perform certain actions, we actually need the interaction of different entities that we actually take from the database. So let's say, for instance, that I want to open a new bank account. Well, when I want to open a new bank account, then probably there are a lot of things that needs to happen, like a lot of validations, things about my bank or information about my bank account should be written maybe in different tables. So we cannot simply do this in the data access layer. So therefore, we have this service layer where that actually knows about all the data access methods. So how can that service get data? So the service layer gets data from the database. It does the processing that it actually needs to perform on the different entities that it got from the database. And then it also instructs the database to write some updates if this is the case. And it returns the processed or some kind of processed result to the caller, which is usually our front-end application, and in our case it will be the API. So once again, to have just a short summary, the domain layer, which is this one, is actually the layer where we have all our core business logic. So the place where we model the problem domain, so where we model the aspect of the real world that we kind of try to solve with our software that we're building. So this is the place where we put all the classes that belongs to that modeling, and all the validation rules and business rules that needs to be applied on those specific entities and classes. Then we have this data access layer that is slowly or solely responsible for handling or working with the database. And then we have this service layer, which is kind of responsible to integrate those together. And of course, last but not least, we'll have our API. So let's go to that one. In this case, we will choose ASP.NET Core Web API. We'll click on next, and the naming will be exactly the same, weather forecasts. And then here, this is the API. So we call this project an API after the dot. We will use also .NET 5. We don't care about Docker, but we want to have Swagger support so that we can easily test our API. And this is actually everything. So now we have this API. When we take actually a look at this API, what we see is that we have this weather forecast, which is actually a model class. So this is something that belongs to the problem domain. So our applications is a weather forecast application, and of course that one of the most important aspects of this application is a weather forecast, or the concept of a weather forecast. And of course this would then belong to the domain layer. But right now in the template, we have everything actually in this API layer, which we can also think about as the presentation layer, let's say. And then if we take a look in the controller, on the weather forecast controller, here we generate some random weather forecast. But this, once again, this should not be the responsibility of the controller. This is something that should be done via a service. And more than that, data should be retrieved. Like, for instance, this is retrieving data. So data should be retrieved from the data access layer. It should be processed if there is something to process in the service layer. And then the service layer should return the information here, the caller, which in case should be this controller. So let's start to refactor our application and move all these pieces into the layers where they actually belong. So the first thing that we can do here is we can concentrate on this weather forecast. So let's just copy here these properties that we have on the weather forecast here, and let's move them to the domain. So we right click the domain project, and here we say add new class. And here in this new class, or actually let's do it differently. Usually in this domain layer, you would have a folder that you will call models, where we would have the core domain model, so, or the classes that model our problem domain. So the part of the real world, once again, that we try to model in our application. And in this folder, let's right click and add a new class. And let's call this class weather forecast. Let's of course make it public. Okay, sorry for the typos, and we'll just paste all the information from there. So we have everything here in our domain layer right now. So this is the very first step that we have done. Now, of course, we have to take out from the controller the entire idea of working with data. And once again, here we actually have two things that we will do, which is the data retrieval process, which is something like that. But we will also move some logic into our domain service or in our service layer. And this being, for instance, how we write or how we calculate this temperature in Fahrenheit, because we calculate it here directly on the property, but we can actually move this in a service and don't tie it actually to a certain property, this type of logic. We just want to have it in a service. So let's kind of try to do that. But before we really do that, there is one very, very important aspect when we create a layered application in ASP.NET Core. And this aspect is contracts or interfaces. Now, the problem in applications are that one layer of the application will mostly also need other layers from the application. Now, in C# and also in other other programming languages, even if it is possible, it's surely not the best practice. We can't have circular dependencies. So we have to architect our applications and our layers in such a way that one layer doesn't depend, for instance, that the domain layer doesn't depend on the data access layer, and the data access layer depends on the other side, once again, on the domain layer. So this is not possible. We don't want to have this type of circular dependencies. So this means that dependencies in a certain way should run in a certain direction. And we will take a look at this right in a few moments. Now, when we think about this is okay, but how can we then, for instance, decouple different type of layers so that we are not tied to certain implementations? And here is where interfaces comes in. And this is the most important topic actually in the whole new modern layered architecture theories that we have. So if we speak of clean architecture, if we speak of ports and adapters, of onion architectures, all kind of like are based on this idea of having abstractions, or more precisely interfaces, so that we do not depend on layers that are actually higher than the current layer where we are. So let's look into this. Now, when we talked about how we created layers, we also created all those layers in a certain order, which is a very, very important aspect, because the order in which we created the layers in this video is actually also the importance of that layer for the specific application. And we started with the domain layer, which is this one, which we said is actually the core part of our application. So where all our business logics resides, and all the rules that kind of model the problem domain that we want to tackle with our applications. The idea is that this core, or this domain, should not depend on any other projects or layers that we have in our applications. So in this case, it means that we should never go here on dependencies and add project reference and add a reference to any other projects that we have here in the solution. If we at a certain point feel or are in a scenario where we need to go here in the domain layer and add a reference to any other layer, this means that we have architected something wrong, and this is a total no-go. So this is the very core of your application. It should not depend on anything. It should be 100% self-sufficient. Now, of course, and this is how we used to program probably 20 years ago, when the programming approaches were more procedural than object-oriented. Of course, in the domain layer, you would have to get some data in order to be able to process and to perform some real business. And the fact that we cannot simply use here, for instance, in the domain layer, repositories from the data access layer or services here from the service layer, means that we cannot actually use that. So while we depend on abstractions, we can define abstractions in the domain layer that are implemented in the layers below the domain, and that then can fulfill a certain contract that we define in the domain. So let's go here on the domain and let's add a new folder. Add new folder, and let's call this folder abstractions. You might even call it interfaces. Now, here in the weather forecast data access layer, we might have a repository, and here in the service layer, we might have a service. So let's define abstractions here for this type of services. So let's click here, add, create a new class. Here, I guess we should have interface, and let's name this weather forecast repository. And here in this interface, let's make it public. Here in this interface, what we do here is we define a method that would return an weather forecast array, and it would be called get forecasts. We should of course add its weather forecast without the S, sorry for that. And right now it should do the trick using, here we want to use the domain because we don't need to use the API. The API should not hold our domain models. So we have here defined in the, once again, in the domain layer, we have defined that contract. So this means that in the underlying or in the more outer layers or said, like for instance, in the data access layers or in the service layer, we should implement those interfaces. And then, for instance, we can have another interface for the service. So let's click here once again on add a new class. Let's just choose interface again. And here weather forecast service. And here let's also make this interface public. And here we'll define a method which will return in this, let's make it this time a list of weather forecast. Let's also add the using, and let's call it process f temperature. And this method, sorry, this is an interface. Here we just have to define it. We say that what we want here is a weather forecast array. That need to be processed, and then we'll return a list of the already processed forecasts. So once again, in the domain layer, we define these abstractions that will be implemented actually in the subsequent layers. So let's go and take them one by one. And in the weather forecast data access layer, let's create a new class here, and let's name it weather forecast repository. And then what we do here is we say that this one actually implements the weather forecast repository, and we'll probably have here IntelliSense helping us. I want to add reference to weather forecasts domain. But once again, right now I am in the data access layer. The domain layer is one step, let's say, below this data access layer. So this actually means that we can do that. So it is okay. Now let's add the reference here. And now, of course, we can implement the interface. So let's provide this implementation. And here, what we actually need to do is actually move all the logic that we have in the controller here in our repository. So we would also take this field containing these descriptions and we will move it here. Okay. And then here in this get forecasts is actually where we would move all the things that we have here in our controller. Controllers shouldn't be responsible for doing such things that we see here. So let's move this in our repository. Once again, in a real project where we would work with Entity Framework Core, this is where we would also inject our DB context and use the DB context to actually work with the data that we need from the database. But we kind of, for this example, just refactor the weather forecast API that comes with the default Visual Studio template, and we use this in memory kind of like data source, let's call it. Now let's implement here this type of behavior. So what we want to do is simply create and return the new array, and actually that's it. Now the one thing that we want to do here in the service on the other side, go to domain, as we said that we want to move this calculation out from here. So here we have a normal get set. In a regular application, you would only have the temperature set in the database once, whatever. In our case, we can or in our case, we say that we would store in the database the temperature in Celsius. And then, of course, the temperature in Fahrenheit should be then calculated by the service. We should not duplicate information in a database that can be calculated, for instance, by a service. So let's create that service. So in this case, we go in this domain services layer, and here's the service layer. So let's add a new class here, and here in this class, let's call it weather forecast service. And this class would then implement this weather forecast service interface. And let's also add the reference and implement the interface. Okay, so what we have here is now this one. Now, in order to implement this, what we would need also the repository, as said. But we don't actually want in our domain service layer. So when we are in this one, if we go to the project dependencies, in this case, we don't want to add a dependency directly on this data access layer, because this data access layer is actually the layer that is the outermost of our application, and the service layer is actually something that it is in between the data access layer and our domain layer. So this means that the service layer should not have a dependency on the data access layer. So the question is in this case, okay, but how can we inject, for instance, a weather forecast repository so that we can get the data? And here comes where this whole thing about abstraction comes in, and it is very, very important. Because as we have defined these abstractions in our domain, so in our domain layer, it means that we will not depend here on a concrete implementation of the data access layer, but instead, for instance, we can have a private read-only field, which is of type weather forecast repository. And let's call this a repo. So once again, you see that here we just depend on an abstraction, on an interface that is defined in the domain layer, but we don't depend, so we haven't added any reference to the data access layer, and we shouldn't. So in the domain layer, in the service layer, if we go to package reference, where is it? Sorry, dependencies, add project reference. The only one that could be a dependency is the domain. So here in this layer, we should not depend on the data access at all, and we should not depend on the API at all. That's very, very important, or super important, or how you want to call it. So in the domain layer, we have no dependency on nothing. It's 100% self-sufficient. In the service layer, we have this dependency only on the domain, because the domain is the layer that is, let's say, with a lower level or on a lower level. So, and then here we can depend on the abstractions that we have defined in the domain layer to make sure that we can get actually all the data that we need. That's why abstractions are for. And that's kind of very, very important. So what this means is that we could use standard dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. So in our weather forecast service, we would inject weather forecast repository, and let's call it a repository, and we'll simply assign it to the field. And that's it. Now, of course, what we can do here is simply, here have forecasts. Let's make it a list. And for each element in the list, what we want to do is, for each forecast, we actually want to set the forecast. Okay, let's see what it is happening here. Temperature F, I guess, should be like this. And this should be forecast dot temperature C. Okay, this one should be okay right now. But this then we should delete this. So okay, so this is what our service does. And then what we can do once again is we can, well, return forecast. But forecast, the initial forecast is an array. So we can say here var processed. But sorry. Of course, we have here an array that comes in. So let's do it like this. So var forecast, so processed equals a new list of weather forecast. That should be fine. And then we can simply have a for each. For each, let's call it f in forecast, because forecast is a collection. So we will just do the calculations. So f dot temperature f equals, and here it would be f dot temperature c, and that's it. And processed dot add, and here we just add the processed forecast, and at the end we just return it, and that's it. So now you see that we have moved all our things here in different layers. So let's remove this one. We don't need it anymore. Let's go, however, in the startup.cs file. And here, of course, in the configure services, we need to add our repository and our weather forecast service. So let's say here services add scope. And here we can specify the service I weather forecast repository, which is implemented by weather forecast repository. Now in this application layer, since it is actually one of the outermost layers at the same level with the data access one, we can actually depend on all the other libraries that we have in our application. So this one was from the domain, and this one should be from the data access layer. And then we also need to add, let's also add scoped. In this case, we just want to use the service. So in that case, we have the I weather forecast service, and that one is implemented by the weather forecast service, which is actually in our services layer. So we will have to add here a reference to our services. But right now we have wired up everything. So in this case, we can just simply move to the controller, remove all the logic here, because we don't need this. Logic doesn't belong in a controller, and instead this also can be deleted. And instead of having having this type of logic in the controller, which is not okay at all, we can just have here a private read-only I weather forecast service. Let's call it service in this case. Here, of course, we would also need to add the reference here, but I guess I have misspelled something. Let's go from the startup here, and I need this I weather forecast service. Let's go back to the controller. Let's delete this and add this one. And here IntelliSense should just make me have a using statement, and that's it. And then of course in the constructor, I want to have an instance of I weather forecast service rejected. And here in the constructor, of course, I assign it to the field that I have created previously. And then what I can do here is simply return service dot process temperature. Okay, let's see what's happened. Okay, we returned here an enumerable of weather forecast, and this should also return a list. Okay, there is no we have to pass in. So yeah, I guess we did something wrong here. But what we can do here in this case, okay, let's do this differently. Actually, in the service, sorry for that, in the interface, we actually don't need this forecast, because what we have done here in the service, so where we have the implementation of the service, we actually can use there directly. And I guess that was also the problems. So var forecast equals, that is why we injected this repository, because we can get forecasts. No, not get hash code, get forecasts. Of course, a typo here once again, we don't need this. So now we get the forecasts, and then we process the forecast and we return everything. And here in this one, in this case, we have this process. And well, in this case, we see that we have an enumerable and we return a list. And here, I guess it's an enumerable. The problem here is actually that the weather forecast doesn't know where to look for. And we have to we need to add the using to the domain, because it was previously using the weather forecast that was defined here. So actually, that's it. Right now, we don't have any error. Everything should be fine. And if we run our application right now, a browser window should open just in a moment. Okay, there is some error. Oh, of course. So sorry. And this is one of the most important things, is that you can go on solution and properties. And when you have several different projects, you have to specify which is the startup project. And of course, since we have only one runnable project, which is the API, we have to set it to start on the runnable project. So now we can just click here, and then the browser window will open. And just in a matter of seconds, we should see our Swagger documentation, which is on the other screen, but I'll bring it over right now. So this loads right now. We have this get, we can try it out, and we can execute once again, and you see that we get a new list of weather forecasts every time that we actually execute this, which is actually nice. So let's kind of like sum up what we have done so far. The idea was that we wanted to actually start from the template that we have in an AspNetCore API, and actually move the different bits and pieces that we have in that project into the different layers of an application. So our scenario was that we want to start a brand new application from scratch, and we wanted to see how we should actually structure our application on different layers, so that it kind of like meets modern software architecture requirements. And for most small and mid-sized applications, this type of layered approach that we have specified here is a de facto standard. So most of the projects are the same. Of course, you might watch this video and have different comments that this architecture is not that good, that it has some cons, that 100% clean architecture might be better, or domain-driven design might be better. And what I want to tell you is that all type of architectures have their pros and cons, and all type of software architectures are kind of like bound to a time when they are created. Like the software architectural pattern that we had 20 years ago were totally different than what we have today. And in 20 years from now, the patterns that will be used at that time will be totally different than what we have today. So kind of like everything continuously evolves. Now, as said, for most of small and mid-sized ASP.NET Core applications, this would be the de facto standard layer approach that most applications that right now are developed and run in the world are actually, or follow actually this type of layers that we have defined. And let's go one by one through these layers once again. So we have the domain layer, which we said is actually the first and very most important layer in the chain. it contains all the business logic for the problem domain that we try to model in our application, containing, of course, all the needed classes. Like for a bank account, it would be a bank account, a credit card, a customer, loan, debt, and things like that. For our application, we just wanted to model some weather forecast application. We have this weather forecast. Now, of course, what we could do is that in this type of layer, once again, as said, this is the very core of our application, and it should be self-sufficient. So the domain layer should never depend on anything else. So if you go to project references, when you are on the domain layer project, you should not see any reference to no other project. Now, the next one in our chain would be the domain or the service layer, which is this one. As I said, this service layer is kind of like a middleman between the data access layer and the domain layer, because it retrieves data helped by the data access layer, but then it processes the data according to the business rules that we have defined in our domain. So in the domain layer. So this is why if we go here on the dependencies of this service, we see that we have the only dependency on the domain, but we should not have any other dependency on the data access layer and on the API itself. Now, the next one, we could take the data access layer, which is single responsible for handling databases, nothing else. So this is the only responsibility of this kind of layer. Now, if we go here to the project references here, we see that here we have once again a dependency on the domain. So we should not have any other dependency in this case. And the application layer, which kind of like is the last one, which actually depends on mostly everything else. So if go to add package reference, we have here, of course, a reference to the forecast domain, but we should also have a reference to the, or we could eventually also have a reference to the service. Although in this case, it is not needed because, and this is the next very important point, in order to be able to kind of like intercommunicate between layers, but not making them depend on them. So we don't want our service layer to depend on the data access layer at all. So in that case, we have used abstractions. So in our domain layer, we have defined an abstraction or an interface for a repository that we have implemented in the data access layer. And we have defined here a contract or an abstraction for an iWeather forecast service, which should have this method process f temperature. So once again, as we have these abstractions here, this means that, for instance, in the service right now, when we want to implement all the logic, we do not depend directly on the data access layer, we just depend on an interface. And the very important advantage on this approach is that as long as I depend on a service that I know that adheres to a certain interface, which in this case is the iWeather forecast repository, at a certain point, maybe there is a requirement that I should change the database. And we would probably, in that case, actually replace this method with another method that kind of like does the same. But as long as it adheres to this interface, then all the consumers will actually not be affected. So I can swap the implementation of this iWeather forecast repository at any time, and my service layer would still work okay, as long as there are no changes to this iWeather forecast repository interface. So this is why abstractions and interfaces are very, very important, because they allow us to actually decouple different layers and make them not depend on concrete implementations, but on a certain contract that it is defined. And as long as something changes in a layer, but as long as it adheres to the contract that was defined, those changes should actually not affect all the others that consume that specific layer or implementation. So, and then of course we have the API itself. As said, in the API, it's important that we shouldn't have any logic. We shouldn't have any processing service or any processing logic here in the controller. The controller should actually just take a request, then find which would be the service responsible to handle that and hand out a result, then pass all the information and call that service, get the data and return or generate actually the response and return it to the requester. This is everything that the controller should do. So we have refactored our controller to actually meet this criteria, that we shouldn't have any processing logic here, or logic that should belong actually to our service layer or to our domain service layer or to the data retrieval layer. So none of these operations should be present in a controller. And that's mostly it. This is how you start a new ASP.NET Core application from scratch. And this is the most standard way nowadays to architect an ASP.NET Core application using this type of layers, like the domain, the data access layer, and the service layer, and of course the API on top of it. So this being said, thank you very much for watching. I hope this video was useful for you. If you think that there might be other people that would find this content useful, then just don't be shy and feel free to share it with them on your social media accounts or at work or wherever. Also, a thumbs up would be highly appreciated. And if you have anything to share to start a discussion, if you want to just add a comment, a thought, or have a question, once again, don't be shy and just use the comment section of this video. I would be more than happy to get a discussion going here on this topic. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.